Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 16th chapter in the book of Leviticus. Herein we read of the protocols to be observed and enforced on Yom Kippur, which was the most sacred single holiday calendar year to the Jewish people. There are 34 verses, and we want to cover it in at most 30 minutes, so we're going to open with the opening verse itself, then we're going to establish kind of what leads up to the 16th chapter. So the opening verse reads, "And Yahweh spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they drew near before Yahweh and died." This takes us back to the 10th chapter. Therein we read that Aaron's two eldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, offered fire on their own terms in an explicit violation of Yahweh's requirements and prescribed commandment. They offered it sprinkled with charcoal, but that it wasn't a mistake, it was a sin. They wanted to burn fire to their own terms, approach Yahweh as they saw fit rather than as he prescribed, and they were summarily killed. But the 10th chapter, the early part, consists of a narrative. Now, the majority of Leviticus is not arranged in a narrative. Some 60% of the Old Testament is narrative in content, and has all the characteristics that entails, namely plot development and character interaction. What we read from chapters 11 through 15 are not narrative. They are instructive and guidelines, and in every opening chapter we read that Yahweh spoke to Moses or Yahweh spoke to Aaron and Moses, so these are monologues, not dialogues. And in the 11th chapter we read the prescriptions of the clean and unclean animals that were physically unclean, those who dwelled near the bottom of the sea or on the ground of the earth and there were certain requirements measured by the split of the hooves, which determined what was clean, what was suitable for eating, and what was not. Clean and unclean, there were definite do's and don'ts in the Jewish diet. And in chapter 12, we read of the purification process for newborns. On the 3rd verse, we read that they are to be circumcised on the 8th day, as was Isaac was done in Genesis 17, and that is to be the signal entry into the covenant community. This is how a child is purified. Then in chapter 13, we read of the regulations for skin diseases and mildew. These were real and potent presences. Leprosy was the most dreaded among them, and mildew is a fungi and just a degenerate life form that breeds sickness and pollutes any community. And then we read of the cleansing for the skin diseases and mildew. It was a priestly process. A priest had to inspect and pronounce a leper or anyone else similarly afflicted clean before they could re-enter into the covenant community. Then in the 15th chapter, we read of unclean bodily discharges, both male and female. Now in the so that establishes the narrative, the chronology of when this monologue. This is just Yahweh speaking to Moses. So we can compare it to the chronology of the narrative, the last instance of which you read takes place in the 10th chapter. 2nd verse, "And Yahweh said to Moses, Speak to Aaron your brother, not to come in at all times to the sacred place inside the veil, before the lid of atonement, which is on the ark, lest he die, because I appear in the cloud above the lid of atonement." So Moses is the receptacle of this revelation. He is commanded to share what he is being told with Aaron, who is the high priest, and as such there are definite parameters to be observed in the execution of his duties. There are details, and there are capital punishment consequences for deviating, as his own sons did. They were burned in the fire for not offering the fire in the prescript. So henceforth, after Nadab and Abihu fade off the scene, Eleazar becomes Aaron's high priestly successor, and he would perpetuate what was given to from Yahweh to Moses, to Aaron, these requirements and guidelines. And the word atonement, now the word Hebrew word kippar, which is translated as atonement, appears some 16 times in this chapter, and it more literally translates to ransom or to remove by paying a price. And we witness both of these goats, the atonement, the sacrificial slaughtering, the substitutionary atonement, and then the scapegoat who removes the sin symbolically of Israel. He wanders out into the desert. So both collectively capture, typify and allude to the Messiah to come, who paid our sin penalty. He is the atonement, capital A, and he also removes our sin as far as the east is from the west in Psalm 103. But he appeared in the cloud. This was his form. This was his physical, visible manifestation to the nation of Israel. And he appeared. The concentration of his presence was in this place where the high priest could enter only yearly, once a year. With this, Aaron should come into the sacred place with the blood of a young bull as a sin offering and of a ram as a burnt offering. Now, the word offering proliferates and abounds throughout the book of Leviticus, and it is synonymous and interchangeable with a sacrifice. So when you sacrifice an animal, you offer his life to Yahweh in substitution for human sin, and that is a sin offering. They were offered to procure our forgiveness for sin. Of course, it wasn't the act itself, but the spirit of faith which executed. It was wholly contingent on the heart of the worshiper, the one who offered a sacrifice. So as apostasy kicked in its reared its ugly head into the covenant community, eventually you had these whole generation of people who were abusing sacrifices by just going over it repeatedly and not having any repentance from their sin. So they thought they were good just by offering the animals, and they could keep on sinning. They missed the mark of repentance. He should put on the sacred linen, long shirts with linen trousers on his flesh, and gird himself with a linen girdon, and be dressed with the linen turban. These are sacred garments, and he shall bathe his body in water, and shall put them on. So we read two requirements, what he is to wear and what he is to do. He is to bathe before putting on what he wears, and the linen would have been the priestly garments, and these would have been very specified. No significant symbolic typological allusions in any of the garb itself, but there are, certain the 12 stones on the high priest breastplate does have typological, but we don't read of any of that here. But the concept of bathing was almost alien to the ancient world. I think Queen Elizabeth bathed twice a year, and she considered that excessive. But the Hebrews always enjoyed a higher survival rate because they were light years ahead of their time in actually bathing themselves and washing them, because when you wash, you eliminate the pollutants that you carry with you. And from the congregation of the children of Israel, he takes 2 male goats as a sin offering and 1 ram as a burnt offering. So these 2 animals were specified for the purpose, and they were from the congregation of Israel. So these were dedicated for that purpose, to offer them as a sin for the entire community. And Aaron shall bring the bull as a sin offering, which is for himself, and make atonement for himself and for his house. So the primary priority, the logically prior priority, is that the high priest cleanse himself before offering the offering, which will symbolically and theoretically cleanse the nation. So there is a threefold process. The high priest is cleansed, the nation is cleansed, and the sanctuary is cleansed. And if the nation isn't cleansed, then the people who come into the sanctuary will pollute it. And he shall take 2 goats and let them stand before Yahweh at the door of the tent of appointment. So this was a specific physical location in the tabernacle. This was the temple's predecessor. This was thought to be the concentration of the divine presence on earth. And there he was to take 2 goats, each for specific purposes of which we already alluded to. They offer the full picture, 2 sides of the same coin, which points to the atonement, capital A, to come. And Aaron shall cast lots for the 2 goats, and one lot for Yahweh, and the other lot for Azazel. And Aaron shall bring the goat on which the lot for Yahweh fell, and shall prepare it as a sin offering. So the lots, now these are a largely pagan practice, but they are sometimes used and authorized by Yahweh to settle disputes and arbitrate and intervene and make his will known in decisions. So duly sanctified and executed by the recognized authority by him of the high priest, this would determine which one belonged to Yahweh and which one would be prepared as the sin offering. So everything is allegedly, from a human or worldly perspective, it is left up to chance, but it is all under the providential arrangement which one shall befall which. But the goat on which the lot for Azazel fell is caused to stand alive before Yahweh, to make atonement upon it, and to send it into the wilderness to Azazel. So this Azazel is the scapegoat, short for a scapegoat. It was to escape the penalty, the execution of the penalty, but on his back were carried the sins which were removed from the camp and the covenant community as far as the east is from the west to the end of this earth. So this goat was the lucky one. He was released back into the wild, and he would wander in the desert, and where as far as he went away, that just meant that Israel's sins were removed from the for that year. So it was to be repeated in perpetuity annually. And Aaron shall bring the bull of the sin offering, which is for himself, and make atonement for himself and for his house, and shall slaughter the bull as the sin offering, which is for himself. So once more, Aaron, the high priest, the executor of this office, must cleanse himself before he cleanses the nation and the sanctuary. So that priority is once more in operation. And shall take a fire holder filled with burning coals of fire from the altar before Yahweh, with his hands filled with sweet incense beaten fine, and shall bring it inside the veil. Now these are very specific and detailed instructions, and to deviate from any of the details carried grave consequences. Serious personal consequences could be incurred for violating any one of these instructions. So these were very, they had to do it exactly into the T, and if the processes within the process aren't observed and maintained, the whole equilibrium falls and fails, and it ceases to function as it should. And he shall put the incense on the fire before Yahweh, and the cloud of incense shall cover the lid of atonement, which is on the witness, lest he die. So the tabernacle of witness, tabernacle of testimony, I believe John refers to it in the book of Revelation, somewhere after chapter 13 and chapter 17. But to return to the passage, the lid of atonement, once more, the atonement, that word appears again. Remember, it means to ransom or remove by paying a price. So we witness both. The sacrificial lamb that is slaughtered to Yahweh for the sin offering is the one who pays the ransom, and the one who is removed is the scapegoat. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the lid of atonement on the east side. And also from the lid of atonement he sprinkles some of the blood with his finger 7 times. Now there are 2 elements in here, the first of which is the direction east. As in the Mosaic, east was most of what else is, because if you look at Israel on a map, there is, to the south is desert, to the north, but there's no real west. It's just the Mediterranean Sea. These were not a seafaring people. And so pretty much the east, the tabernacle always faced east and not west, because they were on the extreme of a continent. And so there was no westward from Israel except the Mediterranean and then the Atlantic. So the east is all that there is from their point. And the number 7 is emblematic of divinity, purity, and wholeness and completeness. Yahweh created the the heavens and the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And the number 7, no matter what day of the year this day falls under, is to be a day of rest, is to be a sabbatical, and also the one day of the year where fasting nationwide is commanded. And he shall slaughter the goat of the sin offering, which is for the people, and shall bring its blood inside the veil, and shall do with that blood as he did with the blood of the bull, and sprinkle it on the lid of atonement, and in front of the lid of atonement. So after Aaron and his family are taken care of, he moves next to the people and does much the same process, repeats much the same protocol, only it is different in direction and an intended emphasis of direction, and he does it at the lid of atonement, and more specifically in front of the lid of atonement, because atonement is what he is procuring. And he shall make atonement for the sacred place because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel, and because of their transgression in all their sins. So he does for the tent of appointment, which is dwelling with them in the midst of their uncleanness. So the temple is the sacred presence, the concentration, the location above all others of an omnipresent being, but he was more especially concentrated there. This was thought to be the very center of his presence, and by his very presence he sanctifies it. But what happens when sinful humans set foot in there? If they're not forgiven, they're going to pollute the sacred place with, by their imperfections and their sins and their in all their sins. So there's the element of totality. It's not just one sin. They're connected to all the sins of humanity. And he does this at the tent of appointment, that is the physical location, and he does it in the midst of their uncleanliness. So he sacrifices an animal surrounded by unclean people, and through that sacrifice, they are theoretically made clean. And no man should be in the tent of appointment when he goes in to make atonement in this sacred place until he comes out. And he shall make atonement for himself and for his household and for all the assembly of Israel. So no man except the high priest should go in there. But I think the custom was that they attached a rope to the bottom of his foot in case he died, because if you died in there, that means on the off chance no one ever literally died in the presence, but it was at least the possibility had to be entertained, and they'd have to be removed. But so they were connected through a rope until he came out. This was once annually, and there he made the atonement for himself, his family, and for all the assembly of Israel. He is making, or procuring the atonement rather, for the sins of the nation. And he shall go out to the altar that is before Yahweh, and make atonement for it. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull, and some of the blood of the goat, and put it on the horns of the altar all around. So the word some is contrasted with all, because some, it means, you can't gather up every ounce of blood that is shed from the sacrificial animal, but some is sufficient. So we don't need all the blood in the world. Again, the amount, the physical volume of the blood is not what makes the difference. It is the faith which the ordinance is executed. And all around, that just means cover it, surround it. The horns of the altar was where the sacrifices were made, and there were horns on it. And he shall sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times, and cleanse it, and sanctify it from the uncleanness of the children of Israel. So sprinkling some of the blood, this is similar to baptism by sprinkling, where a priest will dip his hand in water and sprinkle it on a baby. This is what he did, only with blood in his own finger. So this is the slaughterhouse religion. Sacrifice were a fact of life for all ancient, even the pagan ones, consisted of slaughterings and sacrifices. But 7 times, so there is that number again. 7 represents divinity and completeness and wholeness. So if you want to be cleansed completely, you're going to have to do it with the number which corresponds to the completeness in the divine numerological economy. And when he has finished atoning for the sacred place and the tent of appointment and the altar, he shall bring the live goat. So once this is said and done, then he moves on to the next. It's all a logical trajectory and procession through which this process unfolds. Then Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat, and shall confess over it all the wickednesses of the children of Israel, and all their transgressions and all their sins, and shall put them on the head of the goat, and shall send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a fit man. So with both hands, he's going to put it on his goat, and he's going to confess it. Now, he's not going to list every single sin that is committed by every single individual, but the practice of national confession is more general. We witness examples of these in Nehemiah. He prayed, Daniel, he prayed for the sins of his nation. Nehemiah did. Several people, prophets and priests. So Aaron would pray, and his successor Eleazar, all the way down to the legitimate succession, which was interrupted sometime during the intertestamental period. But all the sins of the nation, now they could speak in general terms, but he would put them on. Now, he confessed it verbally, and he would put it, there was no list that he physically placed on the back of the soon-to-be released scapegoat, but he confessed it with both his hands, and in so doing, all the sins were transferred onto that goat, and he was led away from the camp to remove it from them and procure their forgiveness. And the goat shall bear on itself all their wickedness to a land cut off. Thus he shall send the goat away into the wilderness. The wilderness is the desert. Now Israel is surrounded by desert, and it gets a lot. It's a coastal nation, so there's a lot of life forms, but on the eastern extremity and all surrounding it is desert. And so this, whatever nation this stray goat returned to the wild, released to the wild, would end up in, was really none of their concerns. That he was away was good enough for them. Aaron shall then come into the tent of appointment, and shall take off the linen garments which he put on when he went into the sacred place, and shall leave them there. So the process through which he dressed in these linen garments was bathing, then putting them on, and now after sending the scapegoat off into the wilderness to wander whichever way he will, he takes off the clothes he had earlier put on. And he shall bathe his body in water in the sacred place, and shall put on his garments, and shall come out, and prepare his burnt offerings and the burnt offerings of the people, and make atonement for himself and for the people. So as it began in a bathe, he is the physical cleansing process translates into a spiritual cleanness, at least in the typology or the what it alludes to. And, after he does this, after he's physically cleansed, he is spiritually qualified to prepare the burnt offerings and all this for the people to make atonement. This is the one that's going to be burnt. So there were animals that were atoning animals that had their throats slit, and there were ones that were burnt. There were specific guidelines that we can find in greater detail throughout the book of Leviticus, but it is for himself and for the people. That means everyone, the whole covenant nation. And burn the fat of the sin offering on the altar. So not much, and he who sent away the goat to Azazel washes his garments, and shall bathe his body in water, and afterward he comes into the camp. Now this is an individual distinct from the high priest. We read that it's the hand of a fit man. So the high priest puts his hands over it, and then, but the fit man sends it on its way. So this man was required to wash his garments in water and become before he enters into the camp, because by placing his hand on the sinful animal, he is defiled by proximity of touch until or unless he is cleansed by water, symbolically. And the bull for the sin offering, and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought in to make atonement in the sacred place, is brought outside the camp. And they shall burn their skins and their flesh and dung with fire. So these animals were destined to be burned. That is one way of killing an animal. That is one way of sacrificing, as I mentioned earlier. And they are brought outside the camp, lest, because if it takes place inside the camp, they will be defiled by proximity. So there is a lot of emphasis on physical location, but it all corresponds to the spiritual cleanness and the atonement which this is designed to effect. And he who burns them washes his garments and shall bathe his body in water, and afterward he comes into the camp. So this is another distinct individual delegated to this task, and he has to be cleansed too before he can enter, being defiled by the by the sheer proximity to the touch, to actually pushing it into the fire will defile one, and you too must be cleansed before you can enter into the camp. And this shall be for you a law forever. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you afflict your souls and do no work, the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. So this is an eternally binding annual observation to be observed on the 7th month. That corresponds with what corresponds on our calendar to September and October. But this was the 10th day of the month, roughly corresponds to October 1st. And this was actually the day, if you sync up, if you compare Luke 1 with the priestly designations in 2 Chronicles, you realize that the Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, performed his 9 months before April Fool's Day. That's when John the Baptist was born. 6 months in advance of the Messiah, and who was born on this day. Constantine, the emperor who converted Rome to Christianity, is the one who changed it to December 25th, because that was the birth date of the mythical sun deity Mithras, to whom he continued to pay homage to even after his Christian conversion. But once, so the date, the establishment, and the fact that Yahshua was born on this date indicates the function he came to fulfill, to procure the atonement, capital A, as opposed to lower. But it is binding eternally so, and it is equally applicable to the native and the foreigner who is in the midst of the covenant community. Once they are in that community, they are part of it, and as such, they are not to be exempt from observing the same laws. So this was the only day, afflict your souls. That meant fasting. That is the spiritual discipline of skipping a meal for an entire day. This is the only day of the year where it is commanded, but it is recommended as a periodical spiritual discipline and practice with moderation in mind. And that's the key. It's not no legalistic observance is except what is explicitly commanded. For on that day he makes atonement for you, to cleanse you, to be clean from all your sins before Yahweh. So to be clean in the sight of men and to be clean in the sight of Yahweh are two different things, two different meanings, and two different meanings. But to be cleansed before Yahweh is that nothing can go wrong with that. So that's what we want. It is a Sabbath of rest for you, and you shall afflict your souls, a law forever. So once more it is repeated and reiterated and re-emphasized that this is to be a day of fasting, and they are to afflict their souls, and is to be a Sabbath. No matter what day of the week it falls under, it is to be treated as a Sabbath, a day of worship and rest and fellowship and communion. And this is an eternal law because it is sent by the Eternal One. It originates and emanates from him. And the priest who is appointed and ordained to serve as priest in his father's place shall make atonement, and shall put on the linen garments, the sacred garments. So that word ordained is actually, I thought it was somewhat foreign to the Jewish. I know it's familiar in the Christian vocabulary, but we don't have time to really elaborate. We got to keep this under 30 minutes. But Eleazar, because Nadab and Elihu were eliminated through their being punished for sinning and offering their fire. Eleazar was the son through whom this the observance and execution of this holiday was entrusted. And he shall make atonement for the sacred temple, and shall make atonement for the tent of appointment, and for the altar, and make atonement for the priest, and for all the people of the assembly. So when you sanctify or when you atone for the tabernacle, it could be translated as temple. You're atoning for the people who enter into. Those are the priests, and these are the ones who are privileged to have the access point. And the high priest alone, remember, was privileged to have the access point to the sacred of sacreds. And this shall be for you a law forever, to make atonement for the children of Israel for all her sins once a year. And he did as Yahweh commanded Moses. So Aaron obeyed, he listened, he heard and obeyed what Yahweh had done, had commanded him through Moses, and this marked the origin of what would to become an annual holiday celebrated and observed in perpetuity. It is observed to this day. Of course, even though from the Christian vantage point, Yahshua fulfills the Yom Kippur, it is still valid and harmless if practiced and upheld by Jews. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.